This issue of limited access to be able to buy healthy food, find healthy food, isn't just occurring, as I said, in South Los Angeles, but it hits South Los Angeles harder than it hits some other communities. And it sort of follows a trend that began to happen around the 1920s and 1930s in communities throughout our country when zoning laws came up and people started having to follow rules of where they would put things. So by the 1920s and 1930s, we had real separate neighborhoods. People lived in places based on their race. 1920s wasn't that long after slavery ended in the United States, and in some ways, prejudice began to reoccur. And so the society came up with rules to separate the races, even though slavery had ended. And as new racial groups moved into the country, those groups were also affected by it. So by the 1920s and 1930s, we had real separate neighborhoods. People lived in places based on their race. And when they crossed over to live among other groups, sometimes some very, very harsh things started to happen. By the 1940s and 50s, there were lots of tensions, and Los Angeles was very, very segregated. Blacks really could not live in neighborhoods other than the ones where they were pretty much directed to be, and those were east of Central Avenue. In 1965, here in Los Angeles, there was a race riot, which at that time was one of the biggest race riots that had ever happened in the country. That race riot caused a reaction. It was in the city of Watts, which was a predominantly black area. It was sort of stimulated by or prompted by an act of police brutality. And as a result, a white officer beat a black man, and there was lots of violence that followed that. But almost immediately after that, the geography of Los Angeles really began to change, and a lot of people moved out of neighborhoods adjacent to where blacks lived in Los Angeles, and we call that phenomenon white flight. When the whites moved out, and again, this happened in other places too, but when they moved out, a lot of the businesses followed them. And they also left the housing. And so what you began to see were blacks who moved further west because the whites had moved away. And that phenomenon meant that there were now black people living in neighborhoods where they used to not be able to live, but there weren't stores for them to shop at.